Thank you for joining us on this episode. We would like to say a few words before we begin.
It is with great sadness that we learned of Chris Sandford's passing on the 28th of November 2022, a few weeks after we recorded this episode.
Through the short time Romy and I knew him, we came to see that Chris was a true force of nature, a determined, kind, generous man. He showed his unrelenting perseverance in his work, advocating for and empowering the UK's HIV community.
Despite speaking openly of his experiences of loss, his stories never compelled one to pity, but rather to cherish his candour, a sign of his bravery and benevolence.
We are honouring his wish to release this episode, with the hope it will keep encouraging conversations around how to better support people who are living with HIV. We would like to offer our heartfelt condolences to his loved ones.
May his words continue to carry the legacy he so lovingly built.
Welcome to Table Talk, the podcast series where clinical experience informs optimum human function. I'm Brandon.
And I'm Romy, and our guest today is Chris Sandford. Chris is a governor of the Central and North West London NHS Foundation Trust and a director of education for the National HIV Story Trust, as well as a trustee of both the Bloomsbury Network and the Robert Grace Trust.
He also teaches across a number of universities, such as the University College London, the University College of Osteopathy, the New York University, and the Oslo University. He provides education and awareness around the condition, as well as providing peer counselling and support to over 2,000 patients per year at the Bloomsbury Clinic and Mortimer Market Centre until his retirement in 2019. He is kindly joining us today to discuss his experience working and living with HIV and to break down some of the misconceptions surrounding the disease. Thank you very much for coming, Chris.
My pleasure.
Very excited to have you here. So to get us going, and given your extensive CV and varied CV, can you elaborate a little bit on some of the roles that you play currently?
Right. Okay. I think you've actually missed out in the introduction. Your wonderful introduction, the most important thing. I have been living with HIV for over 40 years. So I've lived through the whole of the pandemic, and we call it a pandemic, I think, now because it affects the whole global population. So yes, I believe very strongly in education. It's the only way we're going to get rid of misconceptions, ignorance, and stigma and discrimination. You can have laws against discrimination, and Britain has very, very good laws against discrimination, but stigma is another issue, and particularly self-stigma. So I try in any way possible to educate the public and students, from 17-year-olds in sixth form colleges right through to mature students in universities, and also doctors. At the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, they do courses for doctors from all around the world in infectious diseases, and I've been involved with that for years, educating people about living with HIV. Because I think the extraordinary thing that we have to acknowledge is Britain has a very, very low rate of HIV compared with other countries, and it is, not a gay disease, but we'll come back to that. And I think, Britain in many respects leads the world in treatment and care. There may be other countries doing research, but for a long time we have had standards of care. We've had guidelines, and in this country we got rid of a lot of the misconceptions around HIV. And I think that goes right back to Princess Diana opening the first ward, and that famous photograph of her shaking somebody's hand. Pity we're not on the TV, because I could show you that. But anyway, but I think most people remember that. And this started a realization that, you can't get it from just touching. Although some people still think you can. Unfortunately, there's so much ignorance around HIV still. So my passion is education now, as you mentioned, I used to work at the Mortimer Market Centre, which not only is this, I think, one of the biggest clinics for HIV in Europe, but also it's a major research centre. And there have been patients cured of HIV, and the last person to be cured was one of our patients. And me and the team, provided education for patients, which is just as effective as talking therapies. Education, if you like, emotional support, practical support, how to, kind of housing, you name it, how to take medication, getting rid of the fear for people living with HIV themselves, never mind the population. There's ignorance all around. It's very difficult to overturn 40 years now of negative media coverage. And so it's going to take time, but we're beginning to do it. We're beginning to change people's attitudes. And particularly, the other day I was in a sixth form college, well, actually before the summer break, but in a sixth form college, and this girl, bless her heart, said, "Oh, I didn't know it was a gay disease." So attitudes are changing.
That's good. It's good to hear, to see that your work is paying off. That's very interesting that you're taking a very multifaceted approach to the treatment of this disease, which clearly, at least given from the scientific data across many different illnesses, as that seems to be the most effective way to treat and manage these things.
I think you're right. I think peer support or peer knowledge is often dismissed. It is very successful and used incredibly well in addictions, for instance, but in other disciplines, no, it doesn't get a look in. That is changing, and gradually, because we're very cheap compared with other people, and also patients believe somebody living with that condition. They often don't believe doctors. You know what I mean? Particularly those with poor literacy skills or poor educational skills. And, so one can reinforce. And I think, particularly at the Mortimer Market Centre, what was wonderful was myself and my colleagues were part of the multidisciplinary team. So, we all spoke the same language. And we were employees just like everybody else, and so we had 4 hours of lectures every week, and went to the conferences and were treated with enormous respect because we could often get results that other people couldn't.
You've covered a few really interesting subjects just in that first section. We're going to come back on a few of those and unpack them, but one of the ones that I was really interested in, you brought up a few times, was needing to educate doctors more about the disease. And so we'd actually think that the medical professionals are the ones who probably know the most, but actually that's not the case. And I wanted to just ask you to unpack that a little bit more.
I think what is interesting is too few universities actually teach HIV, because in this country it is a small problem. 106,648 people are living with HIV. Compared with cancer, that is very small. So it tends to be, not of interest to everybody. And I do find, particularly when I'm working with GPs, people say, well, I don't have any patients with HIV. And I say, that you know of. Because still a lot of patients are afraid of telling their GP. Because you don't have to. You don't have to disclose your status in the UK. If it is so yes. I did a group last World AIDS Day, December the 1st, or round about then, and there were a lot of GPs attending, and they said, "Oh God, we've learnt things we didn't know." And I think this is because it's the same problem with nurses, that people are not taught. They don't think it's an issue in their department. my own GP worked in HIV years and years and years ago. So whenever I see him, which is very rare, we always get half an hour because he wants to know what is the latest, what's happening now. And he always thought it was a joke. He has 9,000 patients on his list. And I think I was the only out HIV person until a few years ago. I think they now have 5. But he thought this was a joke in central London. You know what I mean? Sort of where, about 2 in 1,000, I think, have HIV, which is still tiny. But, he knew very well that he had patients, but they wouldn't actually admit it.
And so considering this lack of exposure to HIV patients, what has that had an impact on how you are treated as a patient? Has that impacted your experience in the healthcare system?
Yes, it has. Definitely. Although it's about 5 years ago, I had a nurse who would not touch me. So I had to put in a complaint. I've had junior doctors not want to touch me. And I can always remember, very junior doctors or students tend to work in pairs. So, and one said, "Oh, he didn't train here." You know what I mean? Sort of, meaning UCL. And you're going like, yes, this is a slight issue. Yeah. Often it's well-meaning. I've had nurses go, "Well, don't you look well?" As if I have to be ill just because I'm living with HIV, because if anything, it's an invisible disease. And I think the other thing that, it was about 4 or 5 years ago now, but this nurse said, "Oh, it's so nice to talk to you rather than you be known as the man with AIDS at the end of the ward." And you're going like, and she was a lovely nurse. But so, that's why I prefer ignorance to discrimination or stigma, because people are just ignorant. But this kind of comment, doesn't affect me. I can argue back, but somebody who's more vulnerable or dealing with it, this kind of comment really, really affects it. Yes, I mean, I'm actually doing a lecture at UCL with a fantastic doctor who's the expert in women's issues, and we will be talking about language. Okay. And it's something medical students always ask, about language, because, yes, language can really hurt vulnerable people.
That's true, I can imagine.
Those are truly fascinating stories about having of dealing with, well, not early days, but given that it's relatively recent in comparison to the rise of HIV, right? That we're still having those misconceptions. Can you share some more of the challenges that you faced through living with HIV?
Well, my partner and I were diagnosed in 1982. Now, we were, in our 20s, I suppose, when we met. We were out gay men. All of our friends and families accepted us. And so we heard on the grapevine from about the mid-70s that something was happening. But it was only in 1981 that, if you like, it became news. And that normally is given as the starting point. The New York Times published in July 1981 an article basically talking about gay cancers and pneumonia that affected gay men. And this was based on 44 cases. Now, knowing how long it is before research and doctors publish things, so those cases go back to, I would say the late 70s. What is very interesting, I've just been doing research into a hepatitis B outbreak in the United States in the mid-70s, and they've done retrospective testing of blood samples, and 6%, I think it's 1976 or 7, had HIV. So, HIV, but one of the misconceptions, HIV has been around for hundreds of years, but this is the first time it was identified. So everybody was in the dark, although, and my partner had come back from New York in 1976. He'd been to New York for the bicentennial celebrations, and the reason I loved him incredibly well, I was the sensible one, he wasn't. But he came back with hepatitis B, which he gave me, and he was ill for about 3 months. Now, looking back, we realised that this was what is called seroconversion. Sero blood conversion for HIV, most probably. Because in 1980, he started getting ill, really strange illnesses, which, and nobody knew what was going on. No, doctors, private doctors, things, and I think, he'd get well, he'd go back to work, etc., etc. And then we read that article in the New York Times, and he immediately said, "Oh my God, this is most likely affecting me." But it wasn't until, the first person in the UK to die was, I think, November 1981. And then in 82, he, finally I persuaded him to see somebody at Mortimer Market. And the young doctor's now a professor and retired, but anyway. We were all young in those days. And... and they said, yeah, we think you, because he started showing signs of pneumonia, a specific pneumonia called pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, and also, Kaposi sarcoma, which is a skin cancer, which are very rare to see nowadays, only late diagnoses. So, I can remember sitting with him in the clinic, and then the doctor turned to me and said, "You're most likely infected too." Now, there was no test. And we went home and...
Really? With no testing, no
confirmation? No, there was no test, no treatment, nothing.
Wow.
So there was no test yet. That didn't happen until 84, 85. I think the trial was 84, 85. The strange thing is, professors disagree, because it depends whether you were on a trial or not, and UCL was one of the major centres. So, so there was no test. All they could do was, there was no viral load test, no CD4 test, nothing. So it was all observational, and I think this is the extraordinary thing. I think HIV care is the gold standard for the NHS, because in the early days, doctors had no answers. And they had to work together. It was observational, it was discussing, it was watching. And we went home and we basically made a pact to keep going as long as possible. We didn't tell anybody at first, and he had bouts of illness, so I was basically looking after him. When the test did come out, 84, I think I took it on a trial. Yes, I tested positive, and I still remember leaving the clinic. I knew. But leaving the clinic and standing on the tube platform, I thought I was going to black out. It had, and patients often talk to me, it was as though the world stopped, or it was like, a film freezing, and you remember, I remember the doctor, I remember the voice, I remember it was snowing outside, you know what I mean, sort of all of those kind of things that, And yes, I literally sat on the tube and thought it was written on the front of my hair that everybody could see. Of course, they couldn't. My partner in 1984 was hospitalized for a month. He was put in a private room in the private wing because that was a side entrance and nobody need know. And at 84 and 85, he was in a couple of times. So in 85, we decided to tell all of our friends the best thing I've ever done. In the sense of, yes, there were tears, but the outpouring of love was extraordinary and offers of practical help. The room in the hospital, junior doctors would not enter, nurses wouldn't enter, cleaners wouldn't enter. I would change the sheets and they would be burnt. One day I arrived and somebody was pushing a tray of food into the room with a broom handle. And they allowed me in because, I had it too. One day, a girlfriend of mine, one of my ex-girlfriends, arrived with her 2 children to visit, and this nurse just went, literally was screaming at us to put on barrier nursing. She called security, I called the matron, and there was this standoff. It was like, a cowboy film. And we won. And the matron actually said, thank you for trying to educate her. But it was terrifying, and the kids were 8 and 9, my godchildren. And their mother was actually working at the American hospital in Paris, where the first samples to be analysed by the Pasteur Institute and in America were taken, and where they'd already had 1 or 2 people with HIV. So she was more clued up than in a strange kind of way we were. But I think it was, how can I put it, a terrible, terrible time, because at the same time the press started having an anti-gay campaign, headlines like, I'd shoot my son if he got AIDS, the gay plague. And we already knew, although I've only seen it recently for the first time, a documentary which the BBC made at the end of 82, beginning of 83, on what was happening in America, called Death in the Village, still available on iPlayer, where they actually say heterosexuals are infected, possibly factor 8 for haemophiliacs, children, But the press in Britain just had a field day, homophobic attacks. And I can remember my partner's name was Robert, picking him up from hospital, and we drove around the corner, and there was a billboard saying AIDS equals death kind of thing. And he just burst into tears, So doctors were fantastic, but they were struggling as well to educate everybody else. 1986 was his last Christmas, and I was doing a production in the northwest of England of a new musical which I'd written during the summer when he came out of hospital, and I got the call he was in hospital again in a coma, and I started commuting up and down just so I could be with him. It's a strange thing. It's something you have to do. You can't do anything when anybody's in a coma, but in a way you have to do it. And after about 2 weeks, I did treat myself to first class, but 8 hours traveling every day. You were going like, this was crazy, but something you had to do. And then one day I turn up and he's awake and he's going like, what are you doing here? Why aren't you at work? You know, can't win. But he was seriously ill. And by this time, he lost a lot of weight. And my family all flew in for Christmas at my place in London. And one of my sisters had just had a baby. But they were all pretty cool about this because they loved him. So I picked him up on Christmas Day. He was allowed out on Christmas Day. And my mother had gone to town with the whole Christmas lunch. And we get home and I discovered when my mother died a photograph she'd taken of him looking like a skeleton. And she'd hid it, basically. And he said he wanted a bath in our bathroom, which is on the 3rd floor. So he was light enough for me to carry up the stairs to the bathroom. And then we lay on the bed and he completely floored me by saying, why do you love me? And, you know, we'd been together, 11, 12 years, and, you know, how do you, kind of. And I think that came because of the discrimination and ignorance he'd experienced in the hospital. And anyway, we had Christmas as best we could. And I bought him a statue of Mercury, which was his sign, and in bronze, which I still have, despite a burglar trying to break it, or breaking it. And on the way back to the hospital that evening, his spleen burst. So he was in agony, and I got him back. By this time, he was in a side ward, basically where they put people who were going to die. Still no specialist ward, still no specialist staff. And this was Christmas Day. The junior doctor said, does he know he's dying? And I said, yes. And the doctor burst into tears. Everybody was in this together in a way, that, so it affected everybody. And yeah, he struggled on until New Year's Eve. And then I think he decided that was it. And he suddenly sat up in bed. I was sitting on the edge of it, sat up in bed and grabbed me and died in my arms. It's something you never forget. And I think it's sort of, yes, it's I think you don't forget it. It was a time of extraordinary love from our friends and my work colleagues, his work colleagues as well. He went back to work at one point and we bought mugs for every one of the 50 employees in his architectural practice. And so extraordinary love, but also extraordinary rejection and ignorance on the part of other people. And he was the first person not to be buried in concrete. And 400 people came to the funeral. His tutors he was South African, his tutors from Joburg came and friends flew in from New York and France and Spain, from everywhere I could think of. His family did not come. So it was a pretty tough time. And of course he died on, kind of New Year's Eve. And literally, 4 months before Princess Diana opened the first ward. So he missed, if you like, the boat there. So that is, if you like, my introduction to HIV. But I still look back and I'm pleased we told people. And most of those people have been fundraising ever since. You know what I mean? Sort of, and you know, kind of, and educating, and you know, kind of. So, and I think that is the way forward. So there is chapter 2 of this story, but perhaps you have questions so far.
Thank you for sharing this story about Robert and making him live again with us, and you know, by remembering him. And we're aware that there is the Robert Grace Trust, after who I believe it's named after him. And I was wondering how that organization came to be.
It was one of his best friends who was in South Africa at the time, and she couldn't get back, and so it was particularly her, and they were great friends from their teenage years. And so, yes, I mean, you know, she was the stimulus and her workplace as well. So, you know, kind of, and it supported patients right up until today at the Mortimer Market Centre. It's very small, and I think no employees, and I think that's why it survived, and it is very small, but you know, kind of, it still supports. It provides an emergency fund for patients at the Mortimer Market Centre.
As you've been working at that Mortimer Market Centre and providing that psychological peer support, could you share some of the stories or insights that have particularly marked you through your period of working there?
Yes, I think it was, if you like, it was the first time really there had been in-house. You know, there's always been support from charities, but the theory of, if you like, developing this was because most people won't ring up a charity and speak to a stranger and say, I've got HIV, can you help me? So the idea was to try and have an in-house team, you know, kind of as part of the multi, so that people could refer to us. Which is why, yes, I mean, you know, it started out as a part-time job, I think 15 hours a week, and within a year it was a full-time job, and then became 6 days a week job, basically, because we were doing clinics every day and then running things like newly diagnosed courses at the weekends. I think education is extraordinarily powerful, and particularly coming from peer support. Most people, up until, say, a few years ago, and still, I was talking to somebody in another clinic on, a month ago. He thought he was going to die, and I'm going, no, because people don't know. Until you're diagnosed, you're just an ignorant member of the public. So it's important to get the right information across. And I think most people, when they're diagnosed, are in a state of shock. And okay, it was on the back of an envelope, but I worked out a patient needs to hear 7 times you're not going to die before they actually believe you. But you have to give reasons. And some patients you cannot budge. You know, some patients you just cannot budge. You know, it may be cultural, it may be religious, you know, but you know, they may have lost all of their family in a sub-Saharan African country, and so they just expect to die. So you've got a lot of information to get across. We had very good working relationships. We were really clued in because we were living with the disease, and we were educated in terms of the medication, how it affected people and things like that. So we had a very good working relationship with some members of the psychology team, for instance, who would not know the risks around, say, oral sex. You know what I mean? So we do a session together. Similarly, I would do sessions with consultants who would say, look, I'll deal with the medical and Chris will deal with all the other issues. You know what I mean? Sort of, and it's a way of introducing. I became an expert in the law because, believe it or not, people still get arrested. Oh, I don't know of anybody I'm talking 3 years ago. Because a really keen young copper who doesn't know, to arrest somebody, it's gold star, isn't it? So you get a lot of ignorance in that. And I do have a colleague who works with the Metropolitan Police now. So I became an expert on the law because a lot of patients worry about, are they breaking the law? Can I infect somebody? What will happen? You're going, no, it's fine. Because with modern medication, you can live a completely normal life, really, apart from taking the medication. We dealt with the prisons. It was always horrible when, you had an appointment with somebody who was handcuffed to a warder. But of course, I wasn't just educating the patient, I was educating the warder. Similarly, with kids brought to the clinic by social care, things like that, or on probation, you were educating the social workers as well. So you always took the opportunity to educate, and it really made a difference. But I have more good stories than bad stories. On the newly diagnosed course, we were very loose in, people. I had people who did the course after being diagnosed 3 days, and it was 3 Saturdays. And they would be very nervous. But also people ranging from, I think the youngest ever was 18, because we didn't really deal with the junior or the young people infected with HIV. That was a separate clinic. But, up to people in their 70s. And we always mix people up. Men, women, black, white, yellow, pink with green spots, you name it, we had everybody in the room together because they would learn from each other. Majors in the army, crane drivers, taxi drivers, asylum seekers, refugees. And, it was really, because there are different levels of fear. So it was structured, quite heavily structured. But it was basically education as therapy. Or therapy as education, whichever way around you want to put it. I can remember one guy, on one course of normally about 15, I had 2 people who'd been diagnosed for 20 years and never talked about it ever to anybody. And it's a huge burden to hide something when you think you're going to die. And I can remember the woman, she put on her best sari and all of that jazz, saying, God, I feel free, at the end of the first day. And the guy saying, I have wasted 20 years of my life because he got into drugs and alcohol as escapism. No. He's now a nurse. You know what I mean? Sort of, and so you get that extraordinary reaction there, and we could build on that. The other thing, often women were diagnosed in the antenatal clinic, and I can remember one woman, she was diagnosed on Christmas Eve, which is awful because, we weren't starting course until January, so she was heavily pregnant, and everybody made such a fuss of her. And when she had the baby, she suddenly found about 5 gay godfathers who ferried her around and, looked after the child, and often you get, particularly women from minorities say, well, I've never met a gay man, or you had all those prejudices to overturn as well. she's never looked back. And the last time I saw her, she first rang me up and said, because I can't remember what happened to the father. But anyway, she rang me up and said, look, I met somebody really nice. How do I tell him? And so we went through the whole process of how to tell somebody. And then she rang up and said, he's really fine about it. You know what I mean? Sort of, and you're going, fine. And then she came in with him and we would provide that service as well. People would meet somebody and then we'd educate them together. So, kind of, and I can remember one woman, kind of, oh God, she married and had children, and he was negative, kind of, because modern medication means you can't transmit it. We'll come back to that. You know what I mean? So women can have children without any problem. Kind of now you can be a father without any problem. So, and I think one of the most extraordinary cases was like, how can I put it? Yes, a boy who'd been late 20s. Who, did the course after 3 days of being diagnosed, who also, and how can I, he was pretty handsome, right? Another guy on the course, pretty handsome. They got married, and 2 years ago they became surrogate parents to twin girls. So, yes, and they're pretty outspoken now. And well, we still have a problem, but we're dealing with that in the sense that they couldn't be surrogate parents in this country. And when I ran up the government departments, they said, yeah, we know, the law hasn't kept up with medical advancements, but it will change. Then COVID came along, so they had to go to Canada, where the law has already changed. But yes, I've watched children grow up. Mothers who never thought they'd be able to have a child, watch the children grow up. And and I also heard some awful stories, particularly people coming from war-torn zones, yes. One woman, her husband had been murdered in front of her, she'd been raped, and her child had been snatched from her. And her consultant and I, we got in touch with the Red Cross. Took the Red Cross 4 years to track down the child. And then the British government repatriated because she was a refugee. You have no choice when you're a refugee which country you go to. But when we found the child, the British government agreed to pay for it. And then I managed to get her like a 2-bedroomed house. You know what I mean? So, and it was really, really. That's why I say there are more good stories than bad. And I think there's in this country, I'll say it now, and we can come back to it. Over 50% of the people living with HIV are heterosexual. In the world, about 95% are heterosexual.
Right, let's just repeat that stat for a second, because that's a very...
In the UK, I think it's 51%. Sorry, I didn't check this morning. 51% of the people living with HIV are heterosexual. And globally, about 95%. That is even taking into account in some countries you can't be gay or bisexual or claim that. But I think the misconception that it's a gay thing goes right back to the early reportings of it, and the homophobia. But even in Europe, other countries, it was other issues, not gay. It was only really America and Britain where it was known as a gay thing. In Scotland, for instance, it was drug addiction problems. Not gay at all. I'm supervising somebody who's doing an MA dissertation on HIV in Scotland. And that was the first thing I pointed out to her. And so she followed up with all the, the facts and things like that. But yes, it is a complete misconception. I think we have to accept that in the early days, no internet. Hello? I used to get the San Francisco Bay Reporter imported and photocopied for the doctors. How did you communicate? To call the other side of the world, you had to go via satellites and wait 24 hours. You know what I mean? So we didn't know. And a most wonderful professor in Indonesia did a meta-analysis of hospital administrations. And by, I think it was 96, by 88, I think there were 22 million people hospitalized with HIV around the world. And by 96, another 28 million. So, but we didn't know. We knew what was happening here. But when you look at the headlines, the hysteria, it was truly, truly horrific. And I think it was a complete homophobic backlash after the gay liberation of the 70s. It had only been legal to have a gay relationship for 13 years before the 80s, let's face it. It was, and people still didn't agree with equality. So.
Do you think the kind of misassociation between homosexuality and HIV impacted how much it was researched, how quickly research happened?
Oh, good on you, Romy. Yes, absolutely. It is shocking that there were no effective medication for 15 years. Governments all over the world, and particularly America and Britain, completely ignored it, swept it under the carpet, until one of my heroes, Norman Fowler, persuaded Maggie Thatcher there should be a campaign. I think that started in, 85, 86. And 22 million leaflets were produced, and it did have an impact. And I think what we, again, the research is, I'm just reading the research, it had a huge impact on how the gay community had sex, for instance. Condoms have been used to stop pregnancies, not to stop transmission. So the gay community behaved impeccably in a strange kind of way, because they started all the charities, all the education, all the, and that was replicated in several countries, in Europe and in America. But America always claims they were the first, blah blah rubbish. I think things got their act together, kind of in 82, Terence Higgins Trust and things like that. And by 83, we had other charities and supports and drop-in centres, because we were on our own, getting no support. The first trial for medication was 88, so 7 years, 88, 18, oh God. 88, I think it started. It was called the Concorde Trial, France and Britain. Kind of named after the aeroplane, or vice versa. And that was the first time there was a trial. I was on that trial. And, it was monotherapy, AZT, which is pretty lethal. I wish I could remember the name of the doctor who said it was lethal for cancer patients, and we give it to people who are ill. And I can remember 81, 82. I can't remember now the exact date. They did a debriefing of the Concorde trial, and there were hundreds of people there, patients, doctors, nurses, and basically they said, it doesn't work.
Just a short post-production note. Chris asked us to correct that date. It was, in fact, 1991 to 1992.
Kind of people fainted, people cried out, people fell to the floor. It was one of the most emotional moments of my life, because this was the only hope. and suddenly there was no hope, it didn't work. But those of us in the know knew that there were new drugs in the pipeline, and what they learnt from Concord is one drug didn't work. They needed 3 drugs, combination therapy, to attack the virus at different stages of its replication. So they learnt that, and this was already, they learnt it pretty quickly, this was already in the pipeline. So this is when real activism started, extraordinary. Even I was one of those annoying people who lay down in Piccadilly and stopped the traffic, because we had to get the medication, which was finally licensed in 1996. That's 15 years after the announcement of HIV in the New York Times. So there was, up until that point, 98% of the people who caught HIV died. Within a year, that was reduced to about 2%. A perfect parabola. The medication worked. Initially, they were up to 20 pills a day at different times, some with food, some without. It was very difficult, and some people chose not to take the medication because of side effects. But there are people who did take the medication and are still around today. And by 2003, the medication being reduced to about 3 pills a day. And then I think 2009, the 1 pill a day was introduced. So, we once, if you like, it was taken seriously, if I say taken seriously, yes, the original question, I think it was ignored. And it was because people thought it only affected the gay community. And the headlines, famously, one chief of police said gay men were dying in the cesspit of their own making or something like that. It was really, really horrible. It's the nature of the sex. It's not sex. And so yes, it took 15 years. Now, the extraordinary thing is, along comes something like COVID, and all the HIV doctors, research doctors in particular, who've been looking for a vaccine or a cure, switched over to COVID, and all that research over 30 years or more was the reason we got a vaccine so quickly. So in the long-term view, it wasn't wasted. And some of my colleagues, a lot of my colleagues were on intensive care, but research doctors at the Jenner Institute and things like that, doing amazing stuff, and I don't think we really realise how important Britain was. It has been acknowledged in Newsweek and the German newspapers, which is interesting, but we don't realise how important the research that has been done here was. But it's, colleagues who I know from HIV, suddenly they're doing COVID. They're all professors now. You know what I mean? So, because, it's a continuum of research. So we're in a much better place now. I digress slightly there, but
no, not at all. Given that research, that very vital research has taken over that seemingly absurdly long period of time, what do you feel that we've learnt from how the world handled HIV in the 80s?
Well, they haven't.
They haven't.
No, I mean, look at the hysteria over COVID. Look at the hysteria over monkeypox. Same kind of headlines. You know what I mean? Sort of appalling. World Health Organization put a stop to that. I think I interviewed the most incredible sister. When I say sister, I mean a sister from a convent, who in the 70s and early 80s was running a bush hospital in Africa, and people were dying. And it wasn't until she got reports of HIV from London that she realised what they were dying of. And of course, people have been dying of HIV for hundreds of years, but it's, again, being contained. So, kind of nobody, until it struck the West, kind of rich, on the whole white, kind of middle class, nobody took any notice. The same things happened with monkeypox. And I think initially, I can remember I was I think the night before I was due to fly to India, the flight was cancelled because that was the beginning of the first lockdown. But when I gone for my jabs at the Hospital of Infectious Diseases, or tropical diseases, sorry, we were all joking. They were 2 floors above my office, so it was easy to pop upstairs. We were all joking about Wu flu. It was happening over there, not here. And monkeypox, my odd job man comes from Gambia and he said, "What's all the fuss? It goes away after 3 weeks." You know what I mean? Sort of, and it's spread by rats, which in Gambia, which are about the size of cats. You know what I mean? So, what's the fuss? But it's affecting, for want of a better word, the West. You know what I mean? So
now it's important.
So now it's important. Oh God, what is it? What are the latest figures? 6,000 people have monkeypox in the world. There are 7 billion people. You have to. It's a bit like in the UK, 106,000 people are living with HIV out of a population of nearly 70 million. That you have to put it into context. It's not easy, but living with HIV for most people, but it is a small epidemic in this country compared with other countries who may have 4, 6, 10 times what we have, and that is in Europe.
And from what you mentioned of your story, especially back in the 80s and the 90s, you talked about feeling hopeless when that AZT treatment turned out not to be effective. And I can imagine that a lot of people might have kind of just sort of ended up drowning in that hopelessness and that isolation that was both, trying to cope with the idea of your own mortality and also the lack of support from peers, family, friends, the medical profession. And how come you didn't end up hopeless? What drove you to get involved in these organizations, get involved in driving this movement forward?
I think I didn't have survivor's guilt. People after my partner died, and subsequently I lost another partner. So I buried 2 partners, 10 years apart, basically. It made me angry, and something had to be done. I didn't feel survivor's guilt. I didn't feel I was angry that people I loved were dying because there was nothing to help them. I think after my first partner died, I had been told, in 1982, when we were told we basically had HIV, or AIDS as it was called in those days, he was given 2 months to live. I was given 2 years to live. And we were determined to live longer. He managed another 5 years, and I'm still here. And I think after he died, I expected it all to happen to me because I've been told because it would happen. And every year went by and I carried on working and I wasn't ill. And, it was, I believe in the power of positive thinking. I think, and I think looking after him rather than worrying about myself in a strange kind of way saved me as well. And I think, for it to happen twice was, and I was really, really worried that I was spreading it. But then the viral load test came out in 1996, more about that later, and they discovered I was undetectable. So I hadn't been spreading, and this was like huge relief. But I think for 14, 15 years, I was expecting it all to happen to me. I sometimes describe it as a Damoclean sword hanging over me and waiting for it to fall. But I just kept on, working and starting support groups and education and things like that, can't say. And the first support group I helped run was, I think, in 1988. And to put it into perspective, there were about 30, all guys, 30 guys, because still there were very few women diagnosed. 3 of us are alive today. So 27 people died. So, you lost an awful lot of people you knew as well as loved ones. But yes, I felt angry. Something had to be done. And, so, even taking part in trials, it may not be about me, but it's about the next generation. It's about, in a way, we've gotten, nearly got a cure now, but I think a cure would be extraordinary. But it is a complex virus, so it won't happen in my lifetime, I think.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that.
That's right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Given that you're before we start to break down some of the mechanisms of HIV itself, I'd like to ask you, what did you know back in the 80s about HIV prior to your diagnosis, to kind of give a little bit of light of what it was then to how it is now?
We knew nothing really about HIV. The actual virus had not been discovered. We just knew people were dying. I think, again, all of the stigma really comes from the early days. That headline in the New York Times about, gay cancer and pneumonia affecting gay men. That headline and it was known in America, not so much here, as GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, which gave it a label which was discriminatory right from the beginning. In this country, we don't even use AIDS now, really. We refer to HIV because it is so loaded. So we knew nothing, really. All people knew was the first reports that there was this cancer and pneumonia affecting gay men. The first few years, by 83, we knew, excuse me, by 83 we knew that it affected women, men, particularly black prostitutes. This is where a lot of the stigma comes from for black women, for instance. But all the focus was on the gay men. And in this country, I've interviewed women who didn't know anybody else because it didn't happen to white women. This is late 80s. And even about 10 years ago, I had a woman in her 50s, white, who more or less had to diagnose herself because she didn't come into a risk group. You know what I mean? So we're still getting the prejudices and the problems from the early reporting days, the prejudice. And I think what is really sad in the States, of course, is kind of, if you like. Oh yeah, I think the other important thing was in the 80s, who could afford American healthcare? Only the white professional middle class in San Francisco and places like that. So, of course, they were already identified because they could afford to go to the clinics. Excuse me. And there's a very interesting film about ACT UP starting, which is quite late, 88 or 89. And this woman turns to the camera and said, I'm not even ill. I've spent £30,000 $30,000 already. We forget, right, who can afford healthcare? So, yes, it was identified in this white, professional, male group who could afford to go to the sexual health clinic, etc. And the tragedy is the Hispanic and black population was completely ignored, who now make up the majority. In this country, yes, the heterosexual community was ignored. Or because everybody said, oh, it's a gay disease, heterosexuals thought, oh. And I would get it even, I've been retired 3 years. Even 3 years ago, I remember a guy, he did not believe that other heterosexuals had it. Even when I, gave him the World Health Organization, as far as he was concerned, he had a gay disease. And I think, we weren't looking at, I believe they've discovered blood samples going back to the 50s when I think a woman who had HIV back then, but nobody was looking for it in women because the focus was on the gay men. So it allowed people to become complacent. And I think this was, a European thing, kind of as much as anything else. All kinds of prejudices. The mechanics of transmission, we'll come to this, from mother to child is complex. And I had friends in Sweden who adopted an AIDS baby out from an orphanage in South America, from Brazil, because the child's mother had died of HIV, or presumed to die of HIV. When they had him tested in Sweden, he didn't have HIV. How, and we know the scandals in orphanages all over the world, children are being condemned without testing. And I support an orphanage a home in South Africa where mothers and children can live together because normally they're separated. It is a terrible tragedy, really, and we're still dealing with it. I think people think HIV is history. It isn't. I think the last figures of 2020 when, I can't remember now, 960,000 people died of HIV worldwide, despite medication, because not everybody has access to medication. And, 20,000 people have died in this country, but 40 million worldwide, or 38,963,000, it is ongoing. And I can remember Ben Shepherd in Parliament actually saying that 500,000 people died unnecessarily because COVID disrupted the medication chain.
I feel like you've really nicely highlighted how we have this urgency to care about this condition more because so many people are suffering with it and dying from it. And at the same time, you've highlighted how actually you can absolutely live with it like a normal person today.
Yes.
If you
have access to medication.
Exactly, if you're seeking the right care.
I can't remember the latest figures, but kind of about 3/4 of the people living with HIV now have access to medication.
Which is
But,
wonderful.
even over the last few years, you've got presidents saying you can cure it with beetroot and, you kind of, no. Kind of, it's extraordinary. If like the myths and misinformation around HIV, it's shocking. If you have access to medication, yes, you can just get on with your life. And what is brilliant in the UK is a person is protected by the law from the moment of diagnosis. So you cannot have any discrimination against you. And this had a huge impact. This was the Equality Act in 2011. And, huge impact on employment, for instance. So I think since the Act, when I was at Mortimer Market, I think I had 5 cases of discrimination, all of which we won.
Wonderful. Could you tell us about one of them that really stuck with you?
I can remember one in particular, a young guy, from Europe, actually from Romania. So come to London, I can be out and gay, etc. And he was working for a hotel chain, and suddenly he's diagnosed. A story too often frequent because they haven't had education about condoms. They haven't had education about risk. Because there'd been no education from where they come from. So, and he was deeply upset and told his supervisor in the hotel, who told all the staff, therefore they refused to work with him. So I took it to ACAS, and we won the case. I think he was able to buy a 10-bedroomed house with nobody ever gets the full lot, but he got compensation. But the hotel chain did a whole afternoon of training for managers. You know what I mean? I don't know whether that supervisor was re-educated or sacked. I can't remember the case now. But again, can you turn it into a positive rather than just a negative? And he could not believe. He expected to be thrown out of the country, he's taken British citizenship because he could not believe that he could be supported.
And so you've mentioned a few of these things that you can do, is joining peer support groups, opening up to family and friends. And I was just wondering if, for anyone who's listening, who lives in the UK and who's recently been diagnosed with HIV, do you have any advice that you would give them? And what kind of things would you recommend they put in place to make this journey easier for themselves?
If you've been diagnosed with HIV, you're most likely getting medication. Therefore, speak to your doctor or the clinic. The clinic will be able to point you in the direction of charity support groups. At Mortimer Market, there is an in-house team still, and education in newly diagnosed courses. That doesn't happen everywhere, but there are charities that support people. So, yes, talk to somebody, ask. Don't be afraid of asking for help and support, because yes, it's important you find out the facts. The fact that people cannot discriminate against you for being HIV. It does not affect, anything now. I can always remember another nice story. A woman, a mental health nurse, but quite senior, wanted to change company. The kind of person who's earning a minimum of £200 a day. So, and she wanted to change company. And she was afraid of what would happen if she changed company. would she have to take a medical, etc., etc. So I rang up. I used to do this a lot and ring up and say, hello, I'm applying for a job with you. I'm HIV positive. Is this a problem? Now, number one, patients would never dare do that. And so it's a lesson because nobody's shocked on the end of the phone because you're either speaking to occupational health or HR. And I was actually speaking to the owner of the company, and he said, rather smugly, he said, oh, take a look at our HIV policy on our website. So I went, okay, thank you very much. The opening line was, we do not expect our employees to disclose their HIV status. Hello? This was a first. And round about the same time, I think it was when people were realizing that if you're on medication, you cannot transmit the virus. We'll come back to that. So a lot of people were feeling slightly freer, if they believe what I was saying. And I can remember 2 people in a week, actually 3 in 2 weeks. One was, he was applying to be a train driver. So does he tell them or not? 2 people working for Virgin Rail and one of the other companies wanted to change jobs. And I rang up the Virgin. The Virgin woman said, HR said, oh no, we've got lots of employees who are HIV positive. The patient nearly fell on the floor because we're talking about something they can't talk about. So that was good. And subsequently, I've done staff awareness training for Virgin, you know what I mean, sort of thing, for the whole group. So you know what I mean, sort of, the train driver, I mean, yeah, so, and he came in and said, they didn't blink. I said, well, now do you believe me that things are changing slowly? But so many of us, that is people living with HIV, don't realise that times are changing, don't realise that they have rights, don't realise that you can get on with your life and have children and, be a father, be a mother, and therefore are self-stigmatising themselves. This is why it's important that if you're diagnosed, doesn't matter how long, that you bring yourself up to date. Talk to somebody at your clinic who will point you in the right direction. Even the good websites. You know what I mean? Sort of, and the charities. You know what I mean? Sort of, they're all excellent. So it depends what you want. Guidance on going back to work, because a lot of people have stopped themselves from going back to work because they think they can't. You know what I mean? Sort of, yes, you can. And, it doesn't matter whether, yes, I had one woman who had been told she couldn't work because she was a nurse, which is totally the wrong information. She was a grade 8 nurse, which is the equivalent of a sister. And I helped her fill in the application. She came in and go, oh, God, I've got it. Changed her life. Yes, I know. And one of my best volunteers, and he's still volunteering for the Bloomsbury network, he's a junior doctor. And I did a big webinar last year, and there he was, mask on, stethoscope around, in his scrubs, and he'd asked permission. And you can do any job now as well. You know what I mean? So it's important to talk to somebody.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing those tips.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing those beautiful stories. And now that you've somewhat demonstrated that, especially in this regard and many others, that knowledge is power in being able to manage this kind of disease, let's start to break down some of the actual mechanisms of HIV and trying to break down some of the up-to-date knowledge about the medications and those kind of things. So to start that off, I'd like to ask you if you could kind of describe and explain what the actual mechanism of HIV is.
Yes, I shall try and make it simple, because nothing is simple in medicine.
Could do a whole podcast on just this.
Yeah. I think the first thing is HIV is actually a very difficult virus to catch, and it is a virus. You can really only get it from sex, unprotected sex that is, through injecting drug use and mother-to-baby transmission. Now, mother-to-baby transmission in the UK now is extremely rare. I think there was one case last year. So, because it is a huge success story, nearly 100% of the women in the antenatal clinics now take the test, so that even 2 weeks of medication can stop the child from being born with HIV. So this is extremely great. So injecting drug use, yes, this is an issue, but it's actually a tiny issue. It's only about 2% of the people, we're talking about the UK, living with HIV are injecting drug use. You know, kind of people always think, oh my God, you know, I mean, no, it's not. Mainly because we have a policy of needle exchange. You know what I mean? So you can get clean needles. And as we saw, I think last year or the year before in the United States, you know, when suddenly you have 144 cases in one small town, if you don't have a needle exchange, if you don't have clean needles, it's very easy to spread. So really, it's sexually transmitted, and we're talking about penetrative sex, basically, vaginal, anal, whatever. Not oral sex, extremely low risk, more or less impossible. So that is how it is spread. What happens is every person has something called a CD4 cell. And these are protective cells, and these are good cells. And if you get HIV latches onto the CD4 cell and turns it into a factory and produces more and more HIV. So basically what happens is, and this is the same if you get a cold or flu or whatever, you know, kind of the virus invades the cell, yes, and replicates inside the cell and then spews out more HIV. And when you're infected, you can, we'll talk about symptoms later, but you can be very ill with something called seroconversion. That is, when your body is adjusting to having a virus in it. It's exactly the same. If we have flu, we get a temperature. It's exactly the same thing. But, you know, basically, HIV invades the body, yes, and uses these cells to replicate themselves. They become a factory. The other thing to bear in mind, and we all have CD4 cells, so we could all potentially, if we come into contact with HIV, get it. However, there is also something called viral load. Viral load is how infectious you are. So, 100,000 is high, less than 50 is low, and is what's called undetectable. And if you have less than 50, you cannot transmit the virus. 100,000, you're highly infectious. Viral load was used a lot during COVID. So some people could be really infectious and you only have to get one sneeze, and other people, no, not. And most viruses, when they leave the body, start to die. HIV, within 27 seconds, it starts to die. So you can't get it from surfaces, nor really can you get COVID from surfaces because it starts to die. The viral load is not strong enough or high enough, right? So, hello, I meet somebody really nice, and, you know, we have sex, and he or she is very infectious. I'm bound to get it. If they're not very infectious, I may not get it. You know, so, for instance, I would have a heterosexual couple sitting in front of me. One has got it, one hasn't, and they haven't stopped having sex. So we have these two factors, CD4, which is the cell which gets invaded by the HIV virus and becomes a factory, but it depends on the viral load that you come into contact with. Now, so that is how it works. And the point is, once the virus starts infecting this one cell, then it produces 100 more viruses from that one cell, and they go on to infect other CD4 cells. So gradually the body becomes overwhelmed by HIV, and therefore the CD4 basically measures the immune system. So basically the immune system becomes overwhelmed and cannot respond to any other infection. So in the bad old days, people would die of pneumonia, would die of something because their body was overwhelmed and couldn't cope with an infection. Does that make sense, or shall I go back and do it again?
Yes, no, that makes perfect sense. Right. And I think just to clarify some things, at least from my understanding, is that the CD4 cell is a type of T cell, correct?
Yes,
and
T helper cell.
A T helper cell, which is an integral part of the immune response.
Yes.
So that's.
That's much better than me. Right, that's much better than me. Right. I think viral load becomes very important when we talk about medication, of course.
Right, and so just to be clear, if you're on the right medication, you can have unprotected sex and not transmit HIV, is that right?
The whole point is we have a whole range of medication now. And from cheap medication costing, a few £100 a year to experimental and more expensive. I think at the last count about 34 different drugs, so we can tailor-make for each person, because everybody's different. And so the medication, the idea of the medication is to reduce the viral load. And it takes between 6 weeks and 3 months to bring the viral load right down to what we call undetectable, which is less than 50 copies per milliliter of blood. Once you get it to under 50, you cannot transmit the virus to anybody else. So yes, you can have unprotected sex, for fun, to have children or whatever. When I found that out, that I was undetectable, I was so scared. I told my lawyer. I told, because my partner said, right, let's ditch the condoms. You know what I mean? Sort of. But basically, yes, the medication reduces the viral load to undetectable, which is less than 50 copies. So even if you have 100,000 or even more, 200,000, very, very infectious, it will come down to under 50 with medication.
What a miracle. We've come so far, if we think about where we've come from.
Absolutely, yeah, but it's taken too long.
Yeah.
I think the other important thing to say is, of course, when you're ill or infected, your immune system goes down, your CD4 count, but that will come up again once you're undetectable. So I've been living with HIV for over 40 years. I know when the first test came out, the CD4 test, I had 1,200, which is very healthy, but I still have between 500 and 600. You know what I mean? Sort of, and I'm 150 years of age now, you as well. So, and your CD4 naturally goes down as you age.
And you've talked about a lot of misconceptions that we have, including HIV not being transmissible by touch, which means that people living with HIV can also seek other treatments, including osteopathy, which is what we study, and this is through osteopathy that we met you. And I was just wondering how you had benefited from this treatment modality, and if you think it might be something to recommend to other people living with HIV.
I think, certainly I've sent hundreds of patients here, because I think it's important that they deal with other physical issues. You know what I mean? Sort of, and And often they feel they can't, or they can't access. And the fact that you have a clinic, the University College of Osteopathy pioneered treatment for HIV positive people, or people living with HIV, is fantastic. And you've been doing it for years when people were afraid to be touched. And people still have strange ideas. I can remember the day I got a telephone call from a woman saying, if I go to a sauna, will I infect other people? Because somebody along the line has said that. Social media is just ridiculous. And I think the really important thing is that you can't get HIV from kissing, from cups, from clothing or food. It's actually a very difficult virus to catch. What is interesting is for instance, at Mortimer Market, we had a gym program as well. So, and people this has been really scary. For a split second, they thought they were going to die. So people tend to want to look after themselves, and get on with their lives once they realize that you can. So yes, absolutely. So, oh gosh, aches and pains, things like this. Very rarely do we see neuropathy problems now, but osteopathy is brilliant for that. With a combination of exercise. I remember one of the students here saying, all you have to do is breathe and move, and then you can stay well. But a lot of people don't breathe properly and don't move enough. So a little bit of help and encouragement is very, very important. I mean, the medication is really very, very effective nowadays with hardly any side effects. People worry about side effects. And there are very few nowadays. I can remember a boy from Eastern Europe, and I was introduced to him, and he pointed to me and said, "You're living with HIV? I thought you'd have spots and a hunched back." Because lipodystrophy, which is a hunched back, hardly ever seen now in clinic. Cancer, skin cancers, hardly ever seen. It's only if you are a late diagnosis that you might have, cancers. But there are very few side effects now. And people worry about it affecting the brain. No evidence for that. You know what I mean? Medication. But all of these myths, you will find on social media, which is why it's important to talk to somebody at your clinic if you have any concerns. And there is no such thing as a stupid question. You have to learn. The medication is, on the whole, pills. I take 2 a day. Some people take 1 a day. If you're complex and you've had a heart attack or whatever, you may take 3, but not handful of pills anymore. There are available injectables as well, that is drugs that can be injected, but they're not commonplace. And quite frankly, I think getting into a routine of taking a pill every day is easy, just as easy as cleaning your teeth. Whereas if you've got to go and have 2 injections in your bottom, every other month, who's going to remind me? So that is, and if somebody's listening who is afraid of getting HIV and possibly is having unprotected sex, then there is something called PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, and this is now available on the NHS. I think it's best to get it from a sexual health clinic rather than your GP. In theory, you should get it from your GP, but I know people don't like talking about sexual health things with their GP. You know what I mean? It's easier to go to a specialist place. But this is very effective, 96% effective, about stopping you getting HIV. So, as somebody joked to me, in Kenya, you get it free with a can of Coke. You know what I mean? So, not quite true, but some countries, yes, because other countries are much more affected by HIV than we are. So, there is also PrEP. If you are concerned that you've taken risks, then you can always go for Sexual Health Clinic or any A&E in the country. You can get post-exposure prophylaxis. It's like the morning after pill, and that is widely available. However, if they will ask you what kind of sex you've had or whether the other person's on medication, because if the other person's on medication, you can't get HIV from them. But that is available as well. And we have all encountered the worried well. That is, people who are so afraid they need a pill. They might give it to you if you're worried well, but on the whole, a wonderful doctor lecturer friend of mine said, right, you go to 2 birthday parties. One birthday party, everybody knows they've got HIV and are on medication. The other party, nobody knows their status. Which is the safest? It's a good one, isn't it? It's the party where everybody knows their status and on medication because nobody's infectious. You can get other sexually transmitted, you can get pregnant, but you know what I mean, you won't get HIV. And I think, it's not the people with HIV who are the issue now around the world, it's the people who are not tested and not on medication. Now, in the UK, we are doing pretty well. The World Health Organization introduced about 5 years ago something called 19-90-90. That is, 90% of people with HIV are diagnosed, 90% are on medication, and 90% are undetectable. That is less than 50 copies. In the UK and London overall, we're something like 98, 97, 98. And we don't lose people. Our sexual health clinics are fantastic. So people are not scared. And of course, it's all free. Not like the States. You know what I mean? So we don't lose people. When I say lose people, people are diagnosed, they stay in care, they take the medication, and this is, And so the aim is to eradicate new infections. How amazing is that? And I think this is my 40th anniversary of being diagnosed this year. But HIV is now a chronic, manageable condition. That is, it's treatable and you can get on with your life. And I think, importantly, to stress again, you're protected by the law.
Wow. That's an incredible piece of knowledge to have, that it's a completely different disease now in terms of the perception of the experience of the person themselves compared to what it was in the 80s. And it's incredible that we've come this far. And thank you for all the work that you've done in changing all of these views and educating so many of the population, and especially in the healthcare population. So, thank you very much for coming to talk to us today, Chris. It's been a real pleasure to have you and all your fascinating insights and experience. And lastly, I would like to thank UCO for allowing us to use their premises to record this episode.